Welcome, Age of Vintage Society. He was one of the most famous American gangsters in history, if not the most famous, and he dominated organised crime in Chicago in the 1920s during the Prohibition era. Capone had the influence over Chicago in the 1920s and 30s. He was seen as a Robin Hood figure by many poor people of the time. How Al Capone made $1 billion a year. Make sure to watch the video until the end and leave your thoughts in the comments. If you are new here, join our wonderful community by subscribing to the Age of Vintage channel. Al Capone, the history's most infamous gangster. How the notorious gangster Scarface was born. Al Capone, by name of Alphonse Capone, also called Scarface, was born January 17, 1899, Brooklyn, New York. He was the most famous American gangster who dominated organised crime in Chicago from 1925 to 1931. Capone was in a street gang as a child. Alphonse Capone was the fourth of 9 children. His parents, Gabrielle, a barber, and Teresa Capone, were immigrants from Angli, Italy. Al, the fourth of 9 children, grew up in Brooklyn, New York. He attended school until the 6th grade, where he dropped out at age 14 after striking a teacher. He worked a variety of odd jobs as a candy store clerk, a bowling alley pin boy, a labourer in an ammunition plant, and a cutter in a bookbindery, all the while serving in the South Brooklyn Rippers and 40 Thieves Juniors, 2 kid gangs, that is, bands of delinquent children known for vandalism and petty crime, that were common in New York at the time. Capone also became a member of the James Street Boys gang during this period, which was run by Johnny Torrio, the man that would become his lifelong mentor, and associated with the 5 Points gang. Capone belonged to a street gang as a boy and dropped out of school in the 6th grade, later joining the 5 Points gang in Manhattan and working as a bouncer and bartender at the Harvard Inn at Coney Island Bar, owned by mobster Frankie Yale. Before Capone turned 21, he was involved in several violent incidents. In a youthful scrape at the Harvard Inn, a young hoodlum named Frank Galluccio slashed Capone with a knife or razor across his left cheek after Capone made a crude comment to Galluccio's sister, prompting the later nickname Scarface. He hated his famous nickname. Capone would attempt to shield the scarred side of his face in photographs and try to write them off as war wounds, although he never served in the military. Criminal associates referred to the mob boss as the big fellow, while friends knew him as Snorky, a slang term that meant spiffy. It should come as no surprise to anyone that Capone often enjoyed a drink himself. Capone's drink of choice was a Templeton rye whiskey. In honour of the OG, Brooklyn bartender John Bush created a drink known as the Al Capone. The drink blends Campari, whiskey and vermouth, but goes heavy on the whiskey. In 1918 he married May Coughlin. The couple remained together until Capone's death and had 1 child, Sonny. By 1920 Capone had moved to Chicago. Some stories claim he went there out of a need to lay low after severely injuring a rival gang member in a fight, while other accounts say Capone was recruited to come to Chicago by Johnny Torrio, a former Brooklyn mobster, then making his mark on organised crime in the Windy City. Capone later shot the winner of a neighbourhood craps game to death as he robbed him of his winnings. Despite being questioned by the police, Capone was let go because no one had witnessed the murder. In another incident, Capone assaulted a low-level member of the rival White Hand gang and left him for dead. Since White Hand gang leaders promised retribution, Yale sent Capone, his wife and his young child to Chicago to work for Torrio. Capone's crime gang raked in as much as $100 million annually. Adjusted for inflation, that amounts to $1 billion in today's dollars. After arriving in Chicago, Capone worked for Torrio, who was part of a criminal network headed by a man named Big Jim Colosimo. When Colosimo was killed, possibly as a hit ordered by Torrio and carried out by Capone's former boss Frankie Yale, Torrio took over as boss and made Capone one of his key aides. In January 1925, Torrio was gunned down outside his Illinois home. He survived the attack but left Chicago later that year, choosing 26-year-old Capone as his replacement. Capone expanded the Outfit, as he referred to his underworld organisation, and went on to become one of America's leading mobsters. By some estimates, his crime syndicate pulled the largest portion from bootlegging, followed by gambling, racketeering, and other illicit activities. A flashy dresser who liked chatting with reporters and became an international celebrity, Capone didn't apologise for the way he made his living. He claimed to be doing a public service for Chicagoans, stating, "90% of the people of Cook County drink and gamble, and my offence has been to furnish them with those amusements." Torrio had moved from New York to Chicago in 1909 to help run the giant brothel business under Chicago crime boss Big Jim Colosimo. Shortly after Capone's arrival in the city in 1919, Colosimo was assassinated by either Yale or Capone himself in 1920 to make way for Torrio's rule. As Prohibition began, new bootlegging operations opened up and drew in immense wealth. In 1924, Capone was responsible for the murder of Joe Howard in retribution for Howard's earlier assault on one of Capone's friends. William McSwiggin, an aggressive prosecutor, attempted but failed to indict Capone when the eyewitnesses to the killing, fearing harm, lost their nerve and denied remembering the incident. Later that year, Torrio and Capone enlisted Yale and other associates to murder gang leader Dion O'Banion in his flower shop. O'Banion's associates, Jaime Weiss and George Bugs Moran, were unsuccessful in their attempt to kill Torrio in early 1925. After a stint in prison, Torrio retired to Italy, and Capone became crime czar of Chicago, running gambling and expanding his territories by gunning down rivals and rival gangs. In 1926, Capone went into hiding for 3 months, after he and some of his gunmen inadvertently killed McSwiggin while attacking other rivals. That evening, McSwiggin had been out drinking with 2 childhood friends, who were also beer runners and other criminals, when he was gunned down in the street. Again, Capone went unpunished. The most notorious of the bloodlettings was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, in which 7 members of Bugs Moran's gang were machine-gunned in a garage on Chicago's North Side on February the 14th, 1929. Also in 1929, Capone served some 10 months in Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia after being convicted of possessing a concealed handgun. Many Americans were fascinated by the larger-than-life image of Capone. On June 5, 1931, Capone was indicted for 22 counts of federal income tax evasion for the years 1925 through to 1929. On June 12, Capone and others were charged with conspiracy to violate Prohibition laws for the years 1922 to 1931. In October, Capone was tried, found guilty on 3 of the 23 counts, and sentenced to 11 years in prison and $50,000 in fines and court costs. He was never charged in connection with the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On the morning of February 14, 1929, 7 men affiliated with the George Bugs Moran gang were shot to death while lined up against a wall inside a garage in Chicago's Lincoln Park neighborhood. The victims included 5 of Moran's criminal associates, along with a mechanic who worked for him and an optometrist who hung around the group. Moran himself wasn't there. The group of attackers consisted of at least 4 men, 2 of them dressed as police officers. The crime became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and stunned the nation. Authorities investigated a variety of theories and suspects to little avail. There eventually was ample public speculation that Capone, a Moran rival, had masterminded the murders. He was in Florida when they took place. However, he was never charged in the case, which went unsolved. Elliot Ness's role in Capone's downfall was exaggerated. As a Prohibition agent, Ness and a small team of men raided illegal breweries and other places linked to Capone's bootlegging operations around Chicago. Because the agents supposedly refused to accept bribes, they were dubbed the Untouchables by the press. Although Ness's work helped lead to Capone's indictment for Prohibition violations, the government instead focused on prosecuting the mobster for tax evasion, and his 1931 conviction on those charges is what sent him to prison. He was among the earliest federal prisoners at Alcatraz. In May 1932, 33-year-old Capone began his sentence for tax evasion at the US Penitentiary in Atlanta. Before his imprisonment in Alcatraz, Capone managed to find a way to live lavishly while incarcerated. He had carpeted floors and furnishings in his cell and even had a radio. More than that, his friends and family lived in a nearby hotel. 2 years later, in August 1934, he and a group of fellow inmates were sent by train to California, then transported to the recently opened federal penitentiary on Alcatraz Island in San Francisco Bay. The maximum security prison intended to hold criminals who were especially violent or had other disciplinary problems had received its first contingent of federal inmates earlier that August. Because Capone wasn't a troublemaker while locked up in Atlanta, he likely was sent to Alcatraz as a way for the government to generate publicity for its tough new facility. While at Alcatraz, Capone, who'd been diagnosed with syphilis during a medical exam at the Atlanta Penitentiary, started showing signs of the disease, including dementia. As his condition worsened, prison doctors treated him with malaria injections in the hope that the fevers caused by malaria would wipe out the syphilis. Instead, the treatment nearly proved fatal for Capone. In January 1939, he was released from Alcatraz and transferred to the Federal Correction Institution at Terminal Island near Los Angeles to serve his 1-year misdemeanor sentence. Capone spent his final years out of the public spotlight. Capone was released from prison in November 1939, then underwent several months of treatment for syphilis at a Baltimore hospital. Afterward, the famous gangster spent much of his time out of the public spotlight, fishing and playing cards at the Palm Island, Florida mansion he owned since 1928. Capone was eventually diagnosed with neurosyphilis and gonorrhea, which he contracted while working as a bouncer at a brothel. The neurosyphilis caused a rapid decline in his mental capabilities, and by the time he died, his doctors concluded that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. In the 1940s, he became one of the first civilians to receive penicillin for syphilis, although it was too late to cure him. In January 1947, the 48-year-old Capone suffered a stroke, then came down with pneumonia. He died at his Florida home on January 25th. Capone was buried at Chicago's Mount Olivet Cemetery, near the graves of his father and one of his brothers. In 1950, the Capone family had the remains of the 3 men moved to Mount Carmel Cemetery in Hillside, Illinois. If you liked this video, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you are new here, and if you want to support my work, please visit my Patreon page. Now it is your turn. What do you think about Al Capone's life and legacy? How interesting that people loved him and often regarded him as a hero, even though everyone knew he was a criminal.